Brian Adam has been a member of the Scottish Parliament since it opened in 1999, and he was recently re-elected in 2003 to a second term. He is a member of the Scottish National Party that they would like an independent Scotland. Currently, he is the convener of the Standards Committee and a member of the Enterprise and Culture Committee. He received his undergraduate degree at Aberdeen University in biochemistry and an MSc in clinical pharmacology, also at Aberdeen. He has worked as a biochemist at Aberdeen Royal Infirmary and the Aberdeen City Hospital. His political involvement began as a leader in a trade union and as a member of the Aberdeen City Council for the Scottish National Party. Brian is an avid fan of Aberdeen football and a sworn enemy of onions. Most importantly, Brian is a friend of the university and has gone to great lengths in assisting students find internships in Scotland. And it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Brian Adam.
Thank you very much, Ben. That's a slightly more accurate introduction than I had from the President of the University. I think a slightly more accurate one than I had from the President of the University when I spoke at the Scottish Mission reunion on Friday night. Just before I start to the formal part of the lecture, I think these days democracy is under considerable pressure. I wonder if we can switch this one off. Can we? Democracy is under considerable pressure, and it's not just under pressure from the terrorism that we're all being told about day and daily, but it's under pressure from the lack of participation. And I think the essence of democracy really is sort of government by consent. It's all about choice. But if we don't exercise the choice, then we have no democracy. If we don't make changes as a result of exercising that choice, there is no democracy. And I think that, I'm worried about Western democracies, that significant sections of society are disengaging from the process. We have a situation where many young people these days just don't bother to vote. They don't think it's worthwhile. They think it changes nothing. Well, unless you participate, and it's not just by voting, then you will never make any changes, and you are handing all the power over to those people who are interested and who do bother, and they may be special interest groups, and we will not get what a true democracy is, which is a reflection of the whole society and all of its parts. And while it's dangerous for politicians to sort of perhaps spend too long navel-gazing, just looking at the process rather than delivering what the public have elected them to do, nevertheless, it is important that we do review the processes that are delivering democracy, because there are changes in society, and we do need to reflect those changes, and we do need to have structures and mechanisms to address the needs of society as a whole. For example, if we don't retain public confidence, and I think in many parts of the world that would regard themselves as democracies, there is considerable lack of public confidence in governments and in the political process. If we don't do that, if we don't work hard to retain public confidence, to engage the public interest, to grow public participation, and to respond to the pluralistic societies in which we live, then democracy will die. It doesn't require bombs to do that. We can just do it through apathy. Now, having said that, I think I'll move on to what I formally came along to say and deal with the Scottish Parliament. A Parliament restored and a democracy found. Well, perhaps, okay. The history of it is that Scotland has had a parliamentary tradition that goes back a very, very long way indeed. There were the three estates dating back to the 14th century, where there were the Lords Spiritual, bishops actually sat in the Parliament. Can you imagine that? Here in Utah, there are many, many bishops. Do you think that they ought to, as of a right, sit in the legislature? I don't think so. I don't think so. But bishops spiritual sat in the Scottish Parliament, and indeed still sit in the Westminster Parliament today. The English bishops sit there, and there were indeed the Lords Temporal. Now, that just depended on whose family you were born into, but eventually they had a little bit of representation from the Commons, and that included the borough commissioners. These tended to be fairly significant merchants, by and large. So that was the start of the process. Moving on rapidly to the 17th century, the situation had happened where people were beginning to not accept anymore that the king had the divine right to rule, and indeed the king trying to impose a whole variety of his views on the population really wasn't working anymore. So there was a national covenant in 1638 where all the areas where the king had perhaps gone against the wishes of the people were detailed, and it was effectively a petition or a statement from the people that they were not prepared to accept that the king was sovereign. They wanted the Parliament to be sovereign, and indeed in Scotland it went further. They wanted the people to be sovereign, and that's one of the main distinctions between Scottish politics and English politics, where the theory is that Parliament is sovereign and that what Parliament says is what goes. In Scottish politics, it is what the people say what goes. Parliament asserted its rights over the monarchy, and come 1707, having had 100 years of a joint ruler, various kings and queens, against the background of a very poor economic circumstances in Scotland, there was an agreement that the parliaments would merge, which is the current situation, or at least it was up until 5 years ago. How did we get to the current devolution settlement? Well, there was a building up of resentment in Scotland that Scottish issues were not being dealt with, as a result of which we ended up with a Royal Commission on the Constitution set up by Mr. Ted Heath, who was the Prime Minister between 1970 and 74. Now, normally when Royal Commissions are set up, it is a way of kicking a very difficult issue into the long grass in the hope that it will all go away. In 1970, the Scottish National Party had its first Member of Parliament elected in a general election, although they won by-elections before that, and the hope was that when the next election came on, the SNP would disappear. Mr. Heath decided that he was having difficulty running the country. At that time, there were big labour disputes, and he couldn't take on the miners, and he decided he would go to the country on the basis of who governs Britain. That was the question, and you'd have thought highly polarised debate. Any third or fourth or fifth party might be utterly marginalised in these circumstances, but that was not the debate in Scotland. The debate in Scotland was who governs Scotland. And against that background, in 1974, 7 members of the Scottish National Party were elected in the first election, and 11 in the second election after Mr. Harold Wilson had won both of these elections. During the 74 to 79 Parliament, it was dominated by two issues. One was devolution for Scotland, and most of the time was spent doing that, and then another series of industrial disputes, which led to the winter of discontent and led to Mrs. Thatcher taking power in 79. But against the back, just prior to her taking power, there was a referendum in 1979, which the outcome of which was that a slight majority, 33% as opposed to 31%, voted in favour of devolution. But you see that the 36% who didn't participate was larger than either of these. Now, there was a wrecking amendment introduced into the Act which said that unless 40% of those who were eligible, that included the dead, the people who had moved, the folk who never ever voted, unless 40% voted in favour of it, it could not be enacted. You know, this is the kind of democracy that we had in 1979. So the 36% who couldn't be bothered to vote, had moved away, or were dead, were all counted in the no camp. Now, is that democracy? Well, I'll leave that for you. And we still have the myth perpetuated that somehow or other the people of Scotland did not vote in favour of devolution. They didn't vote by a very large margin in favour of devolution, but they did, nevertheless, against a whole series of other events. The cause of independence, devolution, was set back considerably, especially after Mrs. Thatcher came to power. For almost 20 years, the Conservatives ran Britain. Now, some people may think that they made a good job, other people may think they made a bad job. But one thing they did do, Mrs. Thatcher managed to drive the Conservatives out of Scotland. Because by the time we get to 1997, that would be approximately, not even 30 years, 25 years after an election in Scotland where the Conservatives had polled more than half the vote. In 1997, there were no Conservative MPs in Scotland at all, and nor indeed were there in Wales. Now, this is a problem that you have if you have a governing party whose interests are focused on one area of the country and they disregard the others. As a consequence of successive Conservative failures, Mr. Blair was elected in 1997. He didn't have any money to play with, but he did know he had to sort the devolution problem. And constitutional issues don't have any immediate costs. They may have costs thereafter, but it definitely gives the impression you're doing something. So we had another devolution referendum in 1998. And clever people, politicians, they always find ways of wording things that are helpful. We did have, prior to that, a constitutional convention involving many of the parties in Scotland, but I can say not involving mine because they refused to countenance the idea that people might even be given the opportunity to vote for independence. But it involved people from many of the parties and from no party, and in particular the churches and the trade union movement were very, very actively involved in it. We had, in the 1998 referendum, at a very late stage, another amendment introduced into the Act for the referendum. They decided they were going to ask two questions. One was, shall there be a Scottish Parliament, yes or no? And the other one was, shall we allow that Parliament to vary taxes? Now, can you imagine a situation where we have, Northern Utah, this is where all the money is anyway. We want to get shot of these hicks from the south. We're going to have two states, and we're going to have a referendum about it. But we're not going to trust the people from the south to deal with the money. They can just look after the other bits of it. And we will ask them whether or not they want to grant their new legislature the power to vary taxes. I think most people would arrive at a conclusion that the people are very unlikely to vote to give anybody the power to raise taxes. So what actually happened in this referendum? Oh, hit the wrong button there, sorry. There shall be a Scottish Parliament. 3-1. The people of Scotland voted in favour. There shall be a Scottish Parliament. Shall we give them tax-raising powers? Almost 2-1 in favour of tax-raising powers. Now, that is a measure of how much the people of Scotland actually wanted to run their own affairs. Home rule, devolution, self-government, whatever you want to call it. The 1998 Scotland Act also set up a consultative steering group which drew up a blueprint for how the Parliament would work. There was a desire to change some of the arcane and unusual practices that were in Westminster to try and make it more responsive to public needs. And they reported in 1999 shaping Scotland's Parliament, which became the standing orders of the Parliament. So what can we do in our new Scottish Parliament? Well, this is the existing Parliament in the Mound, and on the right there are all of the issues which are wholly devolved to Scotland, in which all the policy decisions and the public expenditure are determined in Edinburgh, in the Parliament on the Mound there. Obviously, we didn't quite get the thing in there. These are the devolved matters against the reserved matters. And here we have, oops, I'll have to go back. These are the reserved matters, the ones reserved to Westminster, and you can see it includes the biggies of defence, foreign policy, social security, and some of the sensitive ones like abortion and capital punishment. Now, if you set up a new legislature and power is devolved, and a very famous conservative politician said in the late 1960s, when the first debate was on the go, his name was Erich Powell. He was actually a brigadier in the British Army, and then was a fairly right-wing English conservative for quite some time in the Parliament. He said, power devolved is power retained. And that is exactly the case, that if you give a little bit away, but you retain the right to overrule it, it's not actually power given away. How do we deal with a situation where you've got one long list, you can deal with that, we can deal with this? Because the boundaries are never always clear. So I think it's to the credit of the architects of the Parliament. They set up mechanisms in place to try and deal with that. Lord Sewell, hence the name Sewell Motions, is an academic at Aberdeen University, but he's also an active Labour politician, and he helped drive the legislation through the Parliament. He came up with a scheme whereby, if there happened to be legislation in the same area in Westminster as was required in Scotland, the Scottish Parliament could agree that Westminster would legislate on it, even in an area that the Scottish Parliament had power over, and that is the Sewell motion. The counterpart to it is, in the Section 30 of the Scotland Act, it is possible for Westminster to grant back to the Scottish Parliament some rights that normally are retained in in Westminster. Now, the expectation at the time this was drawn up was that maybe 3 or 4 times a year, at most, the Sewell motions would be used to move the power back to London when in fact it had actually been granted to Edinburgh. So what's happened in practice? We do have these devices to relinquish power to each Parliament. 51 times in the first 5 years we've had Sewell motions, which effectively has moved stuff to London, and 10 in the other direction. Now, the 10 in the other direction are all minor tactical ones which moved small amounts of money north of the border. If you're going to set up a new Parliament, and lots of these are happening all over the world at the moment, you want to look at what happens elsewhere. You want to try and avoid the problems and pitfalls that exist in existing systems, and you want to design it to suit your particular needs. Have we managed to innovate at all? Well, we have actually new parliamentary procedures. We have a unicameral Parliament. We only have one chamber. There is no revising chamber whatsoever, so we have to get it right first time. And the idea is that we're going to have a lot of pre-legislative consultation where an issue will be drafted up, questions will be asked, a consultation will take place, and then a draft bill will be produced, and it will go through a 3-stage process in Parliament. But the idea is to get it right at the consultation stage. We also have a committee structure which is a little different to Westminster. Westminster has moved somewhat in recent years, but the idea of our committee structure was to put the same type of checks and balances into our system as you have in yours here in the United States, whereby the executive would not be overly powerful, that the committees of the Parliament would provide, to some extent, checks and balances against the executive. And indeed, there was a private member's bill in the Parliament to abolish warrant sales. That's a way of recovering debt, which meant that you could have all of your goods put on the street, and they would have an auction on them to recover debt. It was quite barbaric. It is also fair to say that many of the parties had already had this as part of their programme. The government wanted to reject the private member's bill, but 3 committees of the Parliament, cross-party, rejected the government position unanimously, and the government were forced to back down. That part of the checks and balances actually worked. We have a petitions committee. Now, in Westminster, you can lodge whatever petitions you like, and it disappears into a bag behind the chair, whoever's sitting, whoever the speaker is that day, and it never sees the light of day again, I don't think. But we I'm perhaps being a little unkind. But our petitions committee, anyone can lodge a petition. It can be one person lodging a petition, and they may appear before the petitions committee to argue their case. They may have others come along and support them, and the petitions committee can decide whether to invite the executive to respond, whether to refer it to a subject committee to see whether they want to hold an inquiry into it. And we've had some significant matters that were not being resolved by the appropriate local authorities, resolved by the petitions committee through the Parliament. In particular, there was a situation where some offensive material was being spread on fields around a couple of villages in, I say, the Clackmannanshire or Fife, I can't remember exactly which now, and they petitioned the Parliament. And as a consequence of that, that practice was stopped, and a new policy adopted by the government. So it has worked, and it's not just on one occasion. This is just an example. In the first Parliament, we had 600 or so petitions, but naturally enough, you can find systems that work, but there's always people who try to abuse it. We had a gentleman named Frank Harvey, who actually lodged more than 50 of these petitions on his own. Now, we are, in terms of refining the process, we maybe have to do something to address that. But nevertheless, the Petitions Committee does work, and it is allowing people to participate. Probably one of the most significant things in order to allow people to participate and feel that their vote counts, because we don't have a two-party system, as we have introduced proportional representation, or a form of it, which is first past the post plus an additional member system, which is similar to the one they have in Germany. And this is just a little committee meeting. The PR, we've got 73 constituency members, of which I am one in the new Parliament, and it's based, on the same Westminster constituencies. And we've a further 56 regional members, 7 for each of 8 regions, and that is done on a party list system. And in the first Parliament, I was one of those members. And you can see from the slide here, if you look carefully, that the Labour Party, on 39% of the votes in the first election, got 73% of the seats in the first Parliament, whereas my party, on 29% of the vote, got 10% of the first past those seats. The others, that's the biggest example of it. But by the time you include the whole election, including the second vote, it is roughly proportional. The Labour Party still do slightly better than they should, and it's only a slight difference. So we do, in fact, have a Parliament that reflects the views of the whole population. What happened in the 99 election was, this is in a graphic form. The blue-purple one is, in fact, first past the post, and you can see how distorted it is relative to the share of the vote, whereas the red and the green are the share of the vote and the final numbers of seats, and you can see that gives you a rough balance, except when you come to the minor parties aren't in there. And you can see that, let me go back, you can see that Conservatives actually got no first past the post seats, but came back into the Parliament because they still had 16% support across the country. In the second term, this is what happened in relation to the seats. And you can see one of the most significant changes is that where in the first Parliament we had 3 non-aligned or small parties, into the second term we actually have, I think it's 14 or 17. It's a very significant change. The electorate became quite sophisticated. The idea of the second vote was that you probably should vote the same way in order to allow proportionality to come. But the smaller parties discovered that this is a way that they could advance their cause. For example, the Greens, who have somewhere between 600 and 700 members in the whole of Scotland, that is a population of 5 million, they have got 7 members of the Scottish Parliament. And it's because they very cleverly campaigned, second vote Green. And in many places they had nobody on the ground to do it. So the campaign was 1 paid-for mail shot and A4 boards outside all of the polling stations that had on each side of it, second vote Green. And it worked. A comparison with Northern Ireland will show that in their first term, they also had a long tail. And these were, the long tail here is all the fringe unionist parties. Some of them parliamentary, some of them just because the unionists by and large can't get along with each other at all. And you can see there's a very long tail. But in the second term, the tail has almost disappeared. And that's because the main political parties discovered how to target their vote rather better. There is a slight distinction in that their proportional representation system is single transferable vote rather than the additional member. But I thought that was quite interesting. I rather hope that we also can address that when we come to our third term. What are the principles that the Parliament was founded on? Well, that's our wonderful new 10 times over budget building, which will be ready any time now. We should be sharing the power with the people. We should be accountable to the people. We should have proper access and participation, and there should be equal opportunities. And how is it shaping up against these founding principles? Well, how do you measure them? Aren't they rather perhaps a little bit woolly? We have a procedures committee as among one of the 17 committees of the Parliament, and its job is to review the procedures to make sure that it works. And it commissioned the consultative steering group who set up the standing orders of the Parliament to look at it again and invited evidence from Civil Scotland to come along. And how are we doing with sharing the power? Well, the idea is that we really ought to be engaging with almost everybody. This is Arbroath Abbey, where the Declaration of Independence was signed. The real one, not the one that you've got. It's a latter-day one, if I can say that. The idea is that we're going to make sure that the executive doesn't have all the power. That right from the individual up, people will have the opportunity to influence decisions. And the committee structure is designed to make sure that we don't just deal with the legislation that the executive throws at us, but we actually conduct inquiries that are of interest to the general population and indeed particular segments of that population. We have a civic forum established to try and funnel the public's views towards us. How are we doing on accountability? Well, the executive is supposed to be accountable, first to the Parliament and then to the people. We are trying to influence, and indeed have influenced, the executive. The political parties running the Parliament don't have it their own way. Because you can see, we are a Parliament of minorities, not a majority. And it requires accommodation. How are we doing in holding people to account, the individual members to account? There is a standard of behaviour that is expected of the individual members, and we set up an independent commissioner so that we would not be investigating ourselves. That, by the way, is my role in the Parliament. And we have financial and audit systems in place whereby we can chase up any misdemeanours, malfeasances, and whatever. How about access and participation? Well, the idea is we're supposed to be open and accountable. And one of the wonderful things in the Scottish Parliament, certainly in the first term, is that when you disappeared out of the office onto the high street, you were meeting all the public up and down the high street, many of them from foreign parts, but nevertheless, it was quite possible to go along and talk to a government minister just by stopping them on the street. I wonder who that was. Right. The Petitions Committee is, in fact, open to all. We have cross-party groups which include people from outside the Parliament as well as within the Parliament, and they are regulated by the Standards Committee, of which I am chairman. We have a unit in the Parliament itself that is trying to drive forward engagement with the public. And indeed, we have a very interesting innovation called Scottish Parliament Live. And it's an interactive discussion board where if there is a debate ongoing, the public can participate in that debate, and if the individual member who has proposed the private member's business wants to engage with the public, they can actually do it live. I am, along with a colleague, going to be conducting an inquiry into our most important matter, that is the state of Scottish football. That is soccer to you. And currently I'm in discussions with the broadcasting unit to give the public the opportunity to let us know directly what they're doing. Now that's something I don't think you might find in many legislatures, and we are trying to be different. We're supposed to deliver equal opportunities. We are doing the best we can to do that. These are the range of issues which are normally associated with equal opportunities. We are doing our best to address that. We've made our Parliament family-friendly. In other words, we don't have these ridiculous hours that they used to work in Westminster. It is, by and large, the meetings of the Parliament are within the normal day or in the very early evening. And indeed, we even address the issue of religion. Now, I know that in this country the state and religion are separated, but in Scotland we have offered the opportunity for a time for reflection within the Parliament. That may or may not include prayer. And to this audience, I should tell you that twice in the last 5 years, state presidents in Scotland have actually addressed the Parliament as part of that process. Are we going to live up to the expectations that were laid out in the consultative steering group, or are we going to be pragmatic? Well, sometimes these principles are rather woolly. What is accessibility? What is openness? Should we hold any of our meetings in private? Are we going to get better legislature by debating about the nature of the report in private to arrive at an accommodation that will be across the board, or should that cross-party discussion take place in public? These are the kind of things that we are trying to address. I wouldn't say that we'd necessarily come to a conclusion on them. Is it fair to be pragmatic, or should we just stick to some sort of abstract ideal? Well, I think you actually have to be pragmatic, because you're in the business of delivering not some academic, and you'll forgive me that, some academic concept, but you're actually trying to deliver something for the people of Scotland. And what you should do is have principles that you're trying to work to and adhere to, but you have to address the realities. And these ideals can and have been abused by individuals. The more you spell out the procedure, the more opportunity there is to challenge that procedure in terms of human rights or litigation, or this is not fair, or that's not fair, or whatever. And currently, in my role as the convener of the Standards Committee, we are dealing with some very difficult cases where people have deliberately used the procedures just to make mischief. And I can't possibly be quoted in that because the cases are still ongoing. We're going to try and find a balance. The Petitions Committee does actually give access. We have dealt with some high-profile issues which have attracted excessive attention, and that is on the basis that we are open. And these are Section 28, which was the English part of the legislation, Clause 2A in the Scotland, which dealt with the teaching about homosexuality within schools. It was extremely controversial. All of the political parties had part of their platform they were going to repeal this act. It was very PC, but the public didn't want it, and there was a big campaign run against it. 90% of the population said these laws should not be repealed. No one had ever been prosecuted under the laws. And so we picked a fight with the public on something that they weren't interested in, except they didn't want it changed. We did ourselves considerable damage as a parliament representing the people by acting against their wishes. And hunting, you know, the picture of the hunting, the people in the red coats on the horses, and they're really, you know, giving the fox a hard time. Not very much of that actually happens in Scotland. But for decades, it has haunted the Westminster Parliament. All of the parliaments have, you know, had bills to abolish hunting south of the border. They've never succeeded. In the first year of the Scottish Parliament, we had a private member's bill lodged. And one of the reasons that both of these issues came up was because there wasn't a big legislative programme. And the reason there wasn't a big legislative programme is because we were trying to do what we said we were going to do, and that is consult the people first. So it actually takes, you know, a year, 18 months from the idea to it reaches consultation stages within the Parliament. Interest groups, small interest groups, captured the agenda and damaged the Parliament. I voted in favour of both of these having reached accommodations on them, but it didn't do us any favours as parliamentarians. What about devolution? Is this the settled will of the Scottish people? We were assured by the unionist parties at the time of the election that devolution is a settled will of the Scottish people. Once we've got devolution, everybody will be satisfied. And afterwards, of course, the SNP will pack up and go away, and the people won't vote for them anymore. That didn't happen. Devolution is a process, not an event. And we're gradually making changes, and currently we have a debate about the financial powers of the Parliament, as well as the mechanics of the Parliament. And I think I'll show you here a document that should be precious to you as well as it is to me. This actually is the Declaration of Arbroath. It was signed on the 6th of April, 1320, in Arbroath Abbey. It was a declaration of independence. It was an appeal to the Pope at that time to recognise Scotland as independent. In 1314, Robert the Bruce won the Battle of Bannockburn, effectively winning the independence. You needed international recognition. This was an appeal to get that. And finally, at the Treaty of Northampton in 1328, the English king conceded that he had no right to be the overlord of Scotland. This document and the contents of it are mirrored in many ways in the Declaration of Independence of 1776. Now, you may see there are lots of things at the bottom here. These are ribbons with seals on them. At that time, many of the lords couldn't write, and so that they attached a ribbon. They had the wax seal, and they marked it with a ring. And you can see how many of them there are. It's a very precious document, and freedom is very precious. Democracy is even more precious. We're striving in Scotland to improve our democracy. We've certainly had our Parliament restored. I think we've had our democracy restored as well, but it could be improved. Thank you.
I've got Brian to consent to take a few questions before we break, and I wanted before we take the questions to present him with a volume about the history of BYU. I think it's appropriate for a guy who seems to have internalized so much history of his own country, but in my conversations with
Thank you very much.
over the last few days, not only his own country's history, but ours as well. So thanks very much for being with us.
Sorry.
Let me underscore again two things before we go to questions. We do have an active, ongoing internship program with the Scottish Parliament. There are 6 BYU students who are leaving in a couple of weeks for the spring term. If you are interested, you should come see me, Danny Dameron, Ben Miller afterwards, and give us your name. We'd love to talk with you. And second, don't forget the Finnish representative Vita Itala, who is here at 4 o'clock in the library auditorium today. So I'm going to let Brian let you recognize your own questions here.
Well, whatever.
So,
Whatever. Fire away. No questions? Okay, we'll go for lunch. Don't be shy. Yes.
Mr. Brother Parliamentarian, appreciate your lecture. Wonderful. Very informative. Simple question. From time to time I see United Kingdom up here. And when I look at Scotland and Ireland and so forth, where's the unity? I don't see much unity in the kingdom.
Well, indeed. I mean, it was a shotgun marriage in the first place. we were broke. we had sent two expeditions from Scotland to have our own colonies, because England had been very effective in the 16th and 17th century in building up the start of what was the English Empire, then the British Empire. Scotland felt they were losing out in trade. Now, I know how important trade and the economy is to people in the United States. Well, it was important to Scotland as well. But what they did is they identified that if they could capture a particular part of what is present-day Panama, they might control the trade routes. And the intention was even to build a canal. And a gentleman called John Patterson, who was the founder of the Bank of England, and also the founder of the Bank of Scotland, persuaded the good and the great in Scotland to put most of their wealth into an expedition to Darien, the Darien Peninsula. Now, they didn't know about the mosquitoes and all the other horrible things that were there. They didn't really understand the natives, and they were chased out by the Spanish. Now, having had that happen to them once is possibly forgivable, but it happened to them twice, and the instruction given by the English Parliament to the English colonists on the eastern seaboard of the United States was to give no succor to the Scots. Now, if you look today at Connecticut, you will find there are places there called Darien, which would suggest to me that the English colonists on the eastern seaboard of the United States had already decided they weren't going to be told what to do from London, and did in fact offer succor to the Scots. From that point on, the union of the parliaments was inevitable because there was no money. Are we a united kingdom? Well, we are a united kingdom. That doesn't mean to say we agree on politics. A kingdom is just about who the head of state is. And we readily recognise that the current head of state is in fact the head of state of Scotland and has an entitlement to do that, as long as the people of Scotland wish to have a royal as the head of state. Then it will be the present family, because the descent is through the Stuarts. King James VI, a name that you might be familiar to you if you look up the front piece of your Bible. You might find that name there. He, in fact, was the King of Scotland, King James VI of Scotland, King James I of England. And so, in fact, it is our royal family, I would suggest. If you'll forgive me that. But there's always been a certain amount of tensions within the United Kingdom, and devolution was meant to address some of those. I think it has to some extent. There are people like me in Scotland who think it doesn't go far enough, and we seek independence. Yes?
I understand that you're a member of the Young Men's Church. Is that correct?
That's right, I am, yeah.
How does that influence your work in the Parliament, specifically the bill you mentioned with homosexuality in schools?
The homosexuality in schools, okay. Right. Well, I put up the list of the things that were, devolved and retained, and on the reserved list to Westminster, I saw abortion and capital punishment. I thought, well, all the dodgy moral issues are down the road, so I'll be safe enough, even though I belong to a very politically correct party. Most parties in Scotland are politically correct these days. However, very early on I had to deal with issues like euthanasia, and the Parliament made a sensible decision on that. We then had to deal with the lowering of the age of consent for homosexuality from 18 to 16. My party policy was we should do that. I didn't agree with it. I was a party whip at the time, and I didn't vote for it. I didn't vote against it because I wasn't allowed to, but I didn't vote for it. I referred to a debate about Section 28, Clause 2A. Within the Parliament, a Roman Catholic member, a Labour member called Michael McMahon, lodged a pro-family amendment to the bill. And I plucked up the courage and I signed that amendment. I was the only other member of the Parliament who signed it. And then I hid from the Chief Whip and the party leader, hoping that this would just go away. And it was due for debate at the local government committee that was dealing with this matter. and I was on the audit committee at the time, and it was due to be at the same time. 1:45, sitting down in a canteen, I was still tossing in my mind what I was going to do, which one of the committees I was going to go to, when I was tapped on the shoulder by one of the apparatchiks of the party leadership and summoned to the party leader's office. Think, oh, well, had it now, Brian, I'm going to get the bullet now. And our party was very strongly in favour. However, the person who was running the No campaign happened to be a significant party funder. And I think this did have some influence over the party leader, and he was trying desperately to move the party into a stance that was perhaps a little more in tune with the public at large. And he saw me as an appropriate avenue to do that. He invited me up to his office and said, Brian, what are you intending to do this afternoon? And he didn't tell me what his intention for me was. And I said, well, I was in two minds. So he said, I'd like you to go to the local government committee and express your views about the pro-family amendment. So he was kind of hedging his bets. I did do that. The amendment was lost, but the same arguments and the same pressures were existing within the executive. And how can I put this nicely? The various party leaders used me as a tool within both parties to force a compromise that I could live with, and I think the church could live with too, on that. And that sort of thing that will never appear on a piece of paper. I mean, our present First Minister, he was having to run away from these issues because he was under so much pressure. A number of the other government ministers I spoke directly to about it were very grateful for the fact that there had been an accommodation between the two parties on this to try and rein in those who are being politically correct and not being sensible. And so that's the realpolitik that goes on. I hope I don't have too many situations like that, but yeah, that's what happened. Who's next? Nobody else? One at the back, yeah.
At the very beginning of your lecture, you talked about how the important part of democracy is that people are active and participate in democracy. I was wondering what your feelings are in terms of so many democracies today are so large in terms of the sheer number of citizens who are involved in it, and how do you overcome that problem of the volume of people and the inherent problem of inactivity when you have that large amount of people?
I don't know that the size of the constituency or the size of the democracy influences the numbers who are participating. We in Scotland have a population of about 5 million. You've got a population of about 250, 280 million. We have the same participation rates. And your turnout is just about 50% for national elections, for the presidential election. Well, in our most recent election was 2003. The turnout for the Scottish elections was 49%. I think it's a trend that exists across Western democracies. I don't know if there is a correlation between the size of the democracy and the turnout. And that might be something you might care to write a paper on in the politics department. I would have thought it was something that was worthwhile looking at.
Compared to the dull proceedings of the American Congress, we appreciate the British Parliament where there's that kind of circus atmosphere with Tony Blair entertains the give and take. Do you have that kind of arrangement in your Parliament?
We have an almost identical arrangement in our Parliament. It was the wishes of those who were involved in the consultative steering group that we should be slightly less confrontational. But the nature of politics in Britain is so significantly ingrained that confrontational approach, that circus, regularly happens. In Scotland, it happens at 12 o'clock on a Thursday, so you can work it out. You know, it's 7 hours difference. So if you want to watch it, it's actually broadcast live on the internet. It's another one of the innovations. The proceedings are broadcast live, and you can see that. But yes, we do have that. I don't know how helpful it is, but I think if a politician is not able to think on his feet and answer questions directly about important matters, then I don't know that they're worthy to hold the office that they have. And I think that sometimes perhaps your politicians are protected from the hard questions from their opponents and indeed the press. If you'll forgive me that. Yes, John.
What are the biggest obstacles right now to independence?
The fact that people don't vote for it. Sorry, cheap shot. One of the key reasons that the Scottish National Party didn't participate in the Constitutional Convention is because the remit of it was already drawn up to exclude the possibility of putting the question to the people. I don't think that any democratic party that seeks independence should do so in any other way than inviting the people to vote for it. I think the best mechanism is through a referendum. We have constant debates within the SNP about whether we should just accept the results of an election. I favour the referendum route because elections tend to be about more than just that single question. The Scottish National Party had 35 members in the first Parliament. We only have 27 in this. Now, you may think that the cause of independence has gone backward, but in reality, because we are not the only party in the Parliament that favours independence, the actual independence vote rose, both in terms of the share of the vote and the numbers of MSPs who support it in the new Parliament. The Scottish Green Party favours independence for Scotland, and it's obvious what else they support, and the Scottish Socialist Party as well support independence. So if you add their 13 members to our 27, along with some of the independents who are also nationalists, including one who defected from the SNP because couldn't cope with party discipline, but nevertheless got re-elected, there are actually more people, and so we're making some progress there. What we have to do is persuade people that we can make the current Parliament work, but if we had more powers, it would work even better. There is already a mood in the country to accept that we should have full financial powers, and if you have full financial powers, I don't know what the distinction between that and independence is, but it may be that, defence and foreign affairs might not come immediately, but it's financial powers that are important in delivering change. I hope that answers your question, John. Someone else had their hand up. Yes?
Do you feel that there's a direct correlation between the increasing devolution of power and the increasing number of voters that are voting for independence?
It is true to say before the first election that there was a surge in support for the Scottish National Party. The fact that we were actually engaging in the debate meant that people were focusing on the issue, and that encouraged the movement. I think it is inevitable that it will happen. It won't happen until the question is put. And one of the biggest problems the SNP will have is persuading the other minorities in the Parliament to allow the referendum on independence to take place. And for that, we will require a majority within the Parliament. And it's not likely that any unionist party is going to support that on the basis that they might lose. We are prepared to lose. And the reason we are prepared to lose is we're going to keep asking the question anyway till we win. And we only need to win once. Yes.
What are the chief arguments against independence?
What are the arguments against independence? Well, the arguments against independence is that big is good, and that Scotland will be far too small to be an economic success story. The counter-argument to that is you just look across the water to Ireland. Ireland has got the most dynamic economy in Europe. It used to be the basket case of Europe. Since it became independent, since it started to make decisions for itself, since it had a market that was bigger than just the United Kingdom, it has grown, and it has now got a higher GDP than the UK. It is higher than many of the other countries in Europe. So I'm not convinced that that argument works. What other arguments work? Well, strategically, who's going to defend us? Can you possibly afford your own armed forces? Well, currently, we do in fact pay for the UK's armed forces. We do pay taxes, and so there's no reason why we shouldn't. And of course, and again, you'll forgive me this, we won't be into military adventurism, unlike Mr. Blair. Sorry. And what's even worse, we're going to pull out of NATO. Not that we don't believe in collective defence, it's just that we're not too keen on first-strike nuclear weapons. That's the sole reason for it. Anybody else? Or is that... Okay,